It was a cold, quiet afternoon when the FBI raided the Williams family home. The sound of heavy boots pounding on the wooden floors echoed through the house, and the front door crashed open with a loud bang. Agents in tactical gear stormed in, their eyes scanning every corner of the house, weapons drawn and ready. They were looking for something, or someone, but they weren't the only ones who had questions. The entire neighborhood was watching, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. Cars had pulled up along the curb, and people stood at their windows, whispering to each other, trying to figure out what had happened. Everyone was wondering the same thing. Why had the FBI come to the Williams house? But it wasn't just the neighbors who were stunned. Inside the house, everything was chaotic. Mrs. Williams, a mother of two, stood frozen in the hallway, clutching her young daughter tightly to her chest. Her son, 9-year-old Eli, was standing in the living room, pointing at a man who had just walked into their home. "That's him," Eli had said, his voice shaking as he pointed at the stranger in the doorway. "That's the bad man." The room went deathly silent. The FBI agents froze. Everyone turned to look at the man Eli had pointed to. But the stranger seemed just as confused as everyone else. He was tall, with dark hair and a sharp jawline, dressed in a simple black jacket and jeans. He didn't look dangerous at all, but Eli's words had carried a weight none of them could ignore. The man looked around, clearly startled. "What's going on?" he asked in a low, strained voice. But before anyone could respond, the door burst open again. More agents flooded into the house. They took positions around the living room, their eyes scanning every person in the room. The stranger was quickly handcuffed, his face a mix of disbelief and fear. Eli's words had triggered something that no one had expected. The agents didn't seem to care whether he was innocent or not. They were following orders, and Eli's simple, yet chilling, statement had changed everything. "I didn't mean to," Eli whispered, his eyes wide with confusion as he watched the man being led away. "I only said 3 words." The tension in the room was thick, and Eli's mother collapsed onto the nearest chair, her heart pounding in her chest. What had just happened? Why had the FBI raided their house? And why had Eli pointed at the man and said what he did? The stranger's fate was sealed, and everyone was left with more questions than answers. The air felt heavy with uncertainty, and all of them could feel the gravity of the situation pressing down on them. But there was something even stranger about this whole situation. How did Eli know this man? Why did he call him the bad man? And as the FBI agents continued to search the house, one thing became painfully clear. This was just the beginning of something much bigger. Before we can even start to make sense of what happened, the story takes us back to the moment when Eli's life began to change. But even then, no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. The day had started like any other. Eli woke up to the smell of his mother's pancakes, and after a quick breakfast, he had headed off to school with his older sister, Emma. They had spent the day in class, laughing, playing, and doing what kids do best. But that evening, something was off. Something Eli couldn't quite understand. At school, Eli had overheard a conversation between 2 men in the parking lot while waiting for his mom to pick him up. They were speaking in low voices, talking about something that didn't make sense to him. One of them had looked right at Eli, and Eli, being the curious boy he was, had decided to follow them for a little while. It wasn't until they entered an old warehouse on the edge of town that Eli's heart started to race. He didn't know why, but he felt like something was wrong. And then he saw the man, the stranger. Eli didn't know why, but something inside him told him to remember him, to watch him closely. As Eli stood there, hidden behind a pile of crates, the man did something strange. He handed a briefcase to one of the other men, and they whispered something about plans and timing. The conversation was quick, but Eli caught enough of it to know that whatever they were doing, it wasn't good. That's when Eli saw the FBI car pull up, just outside the warehouse. His heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what to do. Should he run? Should he tell someone? But before he could make up his mind, the agents had already moved in. They didn't seem to notice him, but Eli had a feeling that whatever was happening next was bigger than he could understand. When Eli's mom came to pick him up from school, he couldn't stop thinking about the man. There was something about him, something that made Eli nervous. So, when they got home that evening, and Eli saw the man standing in their living room. Everything clicked into place. But how had Eli known? How had he been able to point him out so easily? As the FBI agents continued their search, Eli's mind raced with questions. But one thing was certain. Whatever had just happened, it was only the beginning of something much more dangerous. What would happen next? Would Eli's innocent words lead to more trouble? Would the stranger's secrets be exposed? And what would it mean for Eli and his family? No one knew the answers, but everyone knew that things had just gotten a whole lot more complicated. The story was only just beginning. The sound of the FBI agents rummaging through the house echoed in every room. It felt like the world had shifted in an instant, and no one, especially not Eli, could understand why. Eli sat in the corner of the living room, his knees pulled up to his chest. His mother, Mrs. Williams, was pacing back and forth, her hands trembling. She had tried calling her husband, but there was no answer. It wasn't like him to be unreachable. Panic started creeping in, but she had to stay calm for her children. Emma, Eli's older sister, was holding his hand. "What do you think happened, Eli?" she whispered, her voice quivering. Eli didn't know how to answer. His mind was spinning. He had never seen his mother like this before, and he had never, ever seen the FBI in their house. Not in a million years had he imagined that pointing at a stranger would lead to this chaos. The agents were still sweeping the house, going through closets, drawers, even under the furniture. No one was talking, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. Mrs. Williams tried to ask questions, but every time she opened her mouth, one of the agents would give her a stern look and tell her to stay quiet. "Mom, what's going on?" Eli asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Williams took a deep breath and knelt beside him. "I don't know, sweetie," she said softly, her eyes filled with worry. "I don't know." Suddenly, there was a loud bang from the other room. Everyone froze. One of the agents, a tall man with short cropped hair, emerged from the hallway holding a strange device in his hand. It looked like a scanner of some kind, with blinking lights. His eyes flicked between the device and Eli. "This is it," the agent muttered, his voice cold. The others in the room gathered closer, staring at the device. One of the agents turned to Mrs. Williams. "Where is he? Where is your husband?" Mrs. Williams shook her head, confused. "What? Who?" "Your husband," the agent repeated, his eyes narrowing. "He's not here, but we know he's involved. We need to find him now." Eli could feel his chest tightening. This was all too much for him. How did they know about his dad? What had he done? As the agent's words echoed through the house, another agent entered the room, holding a large envelope. He handed it to the agent with the scanner, who quickly opened it. Inside were several photos, some of which Eli recognized. One of the photos showed his father, smiling, standing in front of a large building. But the next photo wasn't one Eli was prepared for. It showed his dad standing next to the stranger, the man Eli had pointed at. The same man who had been in their house. Eli's heart dropped. How could his dad be involved with someone like that? What had he gotten himself into? "This man," the agent said, pointing at the photo of the stranger. "He's been under investigation for months. He's dangerous. And your husband is connected to him." The room went silent. Mrs. Williams blinked, trying to process what she was hearing. Her voice was barely a whisper. "What do you mean? My husband would never." "Your husband is in deep," the agent interrupted, his voice sharp. "And now you and your children are in danger, too?" Mrs. Williams staggered back, gripping the edge of the table for support. "No, this can't be happening," she said, her voice shaking. Eli felt a cold chill run down his spine. His whole life had just turned upside down. His dad, the man who had always been his hero, was suddenly a part of something dangerous, something dark. He had never imagined that their family could be tied to anything like this. The agents were talking, discussing plans, but Eli wasn't listening. His mind was racing. He couldn't understand it. His dad had always been there for him, always protected him. How could this be true? One of the agents pulled out a phone and began speaking into it. "Yes, we have confirmation. We're going to need backup. The family is more involved than we thought." "Backup?" Mrs. Williams repeated, her voice rising in panic. "What does that mean?" What are you going to do to us? The agent didn't answer. Instead, he looked at Eli, his eyes cold. We'll need to take the boy for questioning, he said. Eli's stomach dropped. He didn't want to leave his mom, not now, not when everything was falling apart. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with fear. Mom, I didn't mean to. I didn't know. Mrs. Williams was already at his side, pulling him close. No, Eli, no one is blaming you, she said quickly, her voice trembling. You didn't do anything wrong. But the agents weren't convinced. One of them took a step forward, reaching for Eli's arm. I need you to come with me, son, the agent said. Eli recoiled, his heart pounding. No, I'm not going anywhere. I didn't do anything. His mother stepped between him and the agent. You're not taking him, she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. He's just a child. The agent hesitated, but before he could say anything, the door to the house flew open. A man in a suit stepped into the room, his face grim. Eli recognized him immediately. It was his father's lawyer, Mr. Carter. Enough, Mr. Carter said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. This is a mistake. You don't have enough to hold them. The agent stepped back, clearly irritated but unwilling to argue. We're not finished here, he muttered before turning on his heel and marching toward the door. Eli's heart was still racing. What was happening? Why was his dad in trouble? Why had he pointed at the stranger? He couldn't stop the questions swirling in his mind. The room felt like it was closing in on him, and he wanted to scream, but he didn't know who to trust anymore. As the FBI agents left the house, taking the stranger with them, Eli stood frozen, his mind still trying to process everything. And then, as the last agent disappeared from view, Eli heard something that stopped him in his tracks. Eli, his mother whispered, there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago. Eli turned to face her, his heart pounding. What is it, Mom? He asked. She hesitated before answering. Your father. He's not who you think he is. And with that, Eli's world shifted once again. What had his mom just said? What was the truth about his dad? Everything was about to change. Eli stood frozen in place, staring at his mother. The words she had just spoken hung in the air, and they felt like a heavy weight pressing on his chest. Your father. He's not who you think he is. Eli's mind was racing. The world around him seemed to blur as he tried to process what his mom had just said. His father was supposed to be his hero, the man who protected him and his family. But now, it felt like everything he knew was unraveling. Mom, what do you mean? Eli's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. What are you talking about? Dad's always been there for us. He's a good man. Mrs. Williams shook her head slowly, her face filled with sorrow. She was struggling to find the right words, but Eli could see the pain in her eyes. He had never seen her look like this before. It was like she was carrying a heavy burden that she had never shared with him. I didn't want you to know, Eli, she began, her voice shaky. I wanted to protect you from all of this. But now it's too late. Eli felt his heart pounding in his chest, his hands shaking. He wanted to yell, to demand answers, but the words didn't come. It was as if his mouth had gone dry, and his mind couldn't form the questions fast enough. His mom knelt down in front of him, her eyes searching his face. Eli, your father got involved with some very dangerous people. He made some bad choices. I don't know all the details, but I know that he's been hiding things from us. Things that could put us all in danger. Eli's stomach dropped. The idea that his father, the man who had always been so kind and protective, could be involved in something dangerous felt impossible. He tried to think of his dad, his gentle laugh, the way he helped him with his homework, the way he'd always made time for him and Emma. No, Eli whispered. No, that can't be true. He would never hurt us. I wish it weren't true, Eli, his mother said, tears welling up in her eyes. I wish I could tell you everything, but I don't know everything. What I do know is that the people your father is mixed up with, they're dangerous. And now we're all in danger too. Eli felt a knot form in his stomach. He wanted to believe his mom, but it was hard to accept. Everything about his dad's life had seemed so normal. The idea of him being involved in something sinister was impossible to understand. But why didn't you tell us before? Eli asked, his voice breaking. Why didn't you warn us? His mother's expression faltered, and she looked away. I didn't want to scare you, Eli. I thought if I kept everything normal, if I kept us safe in our little bubble, that things would get better. But now, things are falling apart. Eli's head was spinning. He felt like he was losing control of his own life. His father, his mom, the FBI, the stranger. Everything was tangled up in a mess he didn't know how to untangle. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, and Eli's heart skipped a beat. His mom stood up quickly, wiping her eyes. I'll go see who it is, she said, her voice still unsteady. You stay here. Eli nodded, though he didn't want to be alone. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of dread creeping up on him. His mother was right. This was bigger than he could have imagined, and it was only getting worse. When his mom opened the door, Eli heard a man's voice, but he couldn't make out the words. Then, he heard his mother's voice again, this time sharp and urgent. No, you can't just come in. I don't know who you are. Eli stood up quickly, his heart racing. He could hear muffled voices and the sound of footsteps. Without thinking, he ran to the door and peeked around the corner of the hallway. 2 men had entered the house. One of them was tall and had a stern expression, while the other had a more relaxed demeanor. Eli recognized the relaxed one immediately. It was Mr. Carter, his father's lawyer. The other man, however, was unfamiliar. He wore a dark suit and sunglasses, even indoors, which made Eli uncomfortable. There was something about him that didn't seem right. Mrs. Williams, Mr. Carter said, his voice calm but firm. We need to talk. We're in a very dangerous situation, and I need to explain what's happening. Eli's mother looked at him, then at the stranger, and then back at Mr. Carter. She was hesitant, clearly unsure of what to do. I don't know what's going on. My husband is missing, and the FBI was just here, saying that. Mrs. Williams, please, the strange man interrupted, his voice smooth and cold. Your husband isn't missing. He's a key player in something much bigger than you realize. And right now, you and your children are in danger because of it. Eli felt his stomach churn as the man's words sank in. They were talking about his dad again, but this time, the words were harsher, more urgent. He didn't like the way this man looked at his mom, or the way Mr. Carter seemed so tense. What do you mean, danger? Mrs. Williams asked, her voice trembling. We don't know anything. We don't even know what's going on. Please, just tell me the truth. The man with the sunglasses stepped forward, his gaze never leaving her face. The truth is, Mrs. Williams, your husband is part of an operation that goes far beyond what the FBI was investigating. He's connected to a group of international criminals, and they'll stop at nothing to get what they want. The FBI wasn't here just to raid your house. They were here because they were hoping to catch him before things escalated. Escalated? Eli echoed, his voice shaking. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to know about criminals or anything dangerous. He just wanted everything to go back to normal. But the man didn't stop. Your family is in danger, and if you want to protect your son, your daughter, and yourself, you'll have to trust me. Eli's mind was reeling. What was this man talking about? What was he trying to tell them? He could feel the weight of his mom's gaze as she looked back at him, but she didn't seem to know what to say either. Everything around him felt like it was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But just then, Eli's phone buzzed. He hadn't noticed it earlier, but now it felt like a lifeline. It was a message from a number he didn't recognize, and when he opened it, his heart stopped. The message read, "They know where you are. Get out. Now." Eli froze. The room around him seemed to spin as he stared at the message. Who had sent it? And what did it mean? Before he could react, the sound of tires screeching outside made him jump. Someone was outside the house. Was this the end? Had the danger finally arrived? Eli's mind raced. His mother's worried face. The strange man. The FBI. And now, the message. The clock was ticking. Time was running out. Eli's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the message on his phone. The words, "They know where you are. Get out. Now," flashed in front of him like a warning sign. His thoughts scrambled, trying to make sense of it all. Who could have sent it? And why did they want him and his family to leave? It was too much, too fast. His mom hadn't noticed the message yet. She was too focused on the man with the sunglasses and Mr. Carter, both of whom were talking quietly in the hallway. Eli's fingers hovered over the phone, but his body felt frozen in place. The screeching tires outside were getting louder. The noise was unbearable, and it only added to the growing tension in the room. Eli could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. What if the message was right? What if they were in immediate danger? "Mom," Eli said, his voice barely audible, but loud enough for her to hear. His voice caught in his throat. "Mom, I think we need to leave. Something's wrong." Mrs. Williams turned to him, her face pale. "What do you mean, Eli?" she asked, her voice filled with confusion. But before Eli could respond, the man with the sunglasses looked at them, his sharp gaze cutting through the air like a blade. "You should listen to your son," the man said, his tone cold and distant. "The situation is more serious than you realize." Mr. Carter, who had been standing by the door, stepped forward. "What's going on, John?" he asked the man with the sunglasses. Eli couldn't tell if Mr. Carter was nervous or if he was just trying to get more information. Either way, his presence only seemed to make the situation worse. Before John, the man in sunglasses, could answer, another loud noise rang through the air. A car door slamming shut. This time, it was much closer, just outside the house. The hairs on the back of Eli's neck stood on end. "What's happening?" Mrs. Williams asked, her voice shaking. "Who's out there?" "I don't know," Eli replied, his eyes wide with fear. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps approaching their door, rapid and heavy. The air felt thick with tension, and Eli's pulse quickened. "I just got this message. Someone knows we're here." Mrs. Williams didn't say anything at first. She just stared at Eli, her face filled with a mix of disbelief and fear. She looked at Mr. Carter and John for help, but neither of them seemed to have any answers. The man with the sunglasses, John, stepped forward again, his face as cold as ever. "Whoever's coming for you. They're not here to play around," John said. His words sent a chill down Eli's spine. "We need to move, and we need to move fast." But before anyone could react, the doorbell rang, this time with a deafening urgency. Mrs. Williams's eyes darted to the door. "Who is it?" she whispered, barely able to control her voice. John motioned for her to stay calm, but Eli could see the tension in his shoulders, in his every move. "Stay here," he said sharply. "I'll handle this." The man turned and quickly strode toward the door. Eli's heart was racing, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. What was going on? Was this really happening? Eli's mother grabbed his arm. "Eli, stay close to me," she said, her voice steady but full of concern. "Whatever happens, we'll stick together. Understand?" Eli nodded without saying anything. His mind was still stuck on the message. "They know where you are. Get out. Now." He wanted to ask his mom who might have sent it, but there wasn't time for that now. John reached the door and peeked through the small window beside it. The instant he did, his face hardened. Eli couldn't see what was happening, but he could tell something wasn't right. The man's body tensed, and his hand hovered near his side, close to the gun he had holstered under his jacket. He turned to look at Mrs. Williams. "It's them," he said in a low voice. "They found us." Mrs. Williams's face drained of color. "What do we do?" "We leave. Now," John said, and without another word, he opened the door and rushed outside. Eli heard the sound of muffled voices and more footsteps, but it all happened so quickly that he couldn't process what was going on. His mother grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the back of the house. Eli had no idea what was happening, but his feet moved on their own, following his mother's lead. He could hear the pounding of his heart in his ears, feel the cold sweat on his skin. They were running from something, from someone. But what? They reached the back door, and Eli's mom opened it just enough to slip through. She didn't hesitate, and neither did Eli. They ran out into the backyard, their feet pounding against the grass, the wind whipping past them. The house loomed behind them, dark and silent, but they didn't look back. They couldn't. Eli could hear shouting now, but it was too far behind them to make sense of. "We can't stop," his mother said breathlessly. "Keep running." But as they ran, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't the only ones moving. There were others, shadows, figures darting through the trees. It was like they were being hunted. "Mom, what's happening?" Eli gasped, trying to keep up. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice strained. John was right. The people after us are dangerous. And your father. Whatever he did, they're coming for us because of it. Eli's mind was spinning. His father, his own dad, had put them in danger. How? Why? And who were these people chasing them? He had no answers, just questions and the cold, biting fear in his chest that made it harder to breathe. The sound of footsteps grew louder. They weren't alone anymore. Someone was getting closer. Suddenly, the backyard fence ahead of them creaked, and Eli's heart skipped a beat. There was someone waiting on the other side. "Mom, look out!" Eli cried out. His mother stopped dead in her tracks. Eli's eyes went wide in terror as he saw a dark figure leap over the fence, landing in front of them. The figure was tall, wearing dark clothing. Eli couldn't make out his face, but he could feel the danger radiating from him. Without a word, the man reached for them. "Run!" Mrs. Williams screamed. "Run!" Eli felt the world closing in as the man's hands reached toward him. He had no choice. He turned and ran as fast as he could, but he could hear the man's footsteps right behind him. The chase was on, and Eli didn't know if he'd make it out alive. Eli's legs burned as he ran, pushing himself faster than he ever had before. His mother's hand was gripping his, pulling him along through the dark backyard. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind them, relentless, growing closer with every passing second. "Mom, hurry!" Eli panted, barely able to keep up. His mother didn't answer. She was focused, her breath coming in short gasps as they dashed through the yard, the cold night air stinging their faces. Eli could hear the man's footsteps closing in, his breath quick and uneven as he gained on them. The man was faster, stronger. They wouldn't outrun him for long. The fence ahead loomed larger, and Eli's eyes flicked to it desperately. If they could just reach it, maybe they could climb over and get away. But it seemed so far away, and the figure behind them was gaining ground fast. "Mom, we need to get to the fence," Eli shouted, looking back over his shoulder. The man was only a few yards away now, his face still obscured by the shadows, but Eli could see his long strides and his determination. They were being hunted, and there was no place to hide. "Almost there," Mrs. Williams said through clenched teeth, her voice filled with urgency. She pulled Eli's hand, making him run even faster, but just as they neared the fence, Eli's foot caught on something, a rock or maybe a root. He stumbled and almost fell, but his mother grabbed him, steadying him. The man's footsteps thundered closer, now only a few feet away. Eli's heart was pounding in his chest, and panic surged through him. They were so close to the fence, but it felt like they'd never make it in time. "Go!" his mother screamed, her eyes wide with terror. But before they could reach the fence, a sharp voice rang out, cutting through the air. "Stop!" Eli froze, his blood running cold. He didn't dare turn around, but he could feel the man's presence right behind them, his hand just inches from grabbing them. Suddenly, another figure appeared, blocking their path. This one was tall, dressed in black tactical gear, and he had a look of cold determination in his eyes. Eli couldn't make out his face in the dark, but he didn't need to see it to know that this was someone they didn't want to mess with. "Move," the man commanded, his voice deep and threatening. Eli's mom stepped in front of him instinctively, her body trembling. "Get away from us," she demanded, her voice shaky but defiant. She was scared, but Eli could see the fire in her eyes. She wouldn't let him take them without a fight. The man didn't move. Instead, he raised his hand, signaling to someone behind him. Seconds later, two more figures appeared, emerging from the shadows like ghosts. Eli's heart dropped. They were surrounded. "Mom," Eli whispered, barely able to speak. "What do we do?" But Mrs. Williams didn't answer. She was looking around frantically, trying to find a way out. They were trapped. The man in front of them took a step forward, his hand reaching for something at his side. "No," Mrs. Williams said, her voice low and filled with desperation. "You won't take us. We won't go." Eli watched his mom, his mind racing, trying to think of a way out. His thoughts were spinning, too many questions flooding his mind. Who were these people? What did they want from them? And why were they chasing them? The man with the tactical gear stepped closer, his hand tightening on the weapon at his side. Eli could see the cold determination in his eyes, and for a brief moment, everything felt like it was slipping away. They were out of options, out of time. But then, just as Eli thought everything was lost, a loud crash interrupted the tense standoff. A car had crashed through the trees, screeching to a halt just inches away from the group. The headlights blinded Eli for a moment, but he could hear the engine roar and the tires screeching on the gravel. The door to the car swung open, and a figure leaped out, moving with purpose and confidence. "Everyone, get in!" the voice shouted. It was deep, commanding, but there was something familiar about it. Eli blinked, trying to make sense of what was happening. The man in tactical gear seemed momentarily distracted, his attention shifting to the car and the new figure who had appeared. For that brief moment of hesitation, Mrs. Williams grabbed Eli's hand and pulled him toward the car. "Come on," she urged, her voice desperate. Eli didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed her hand, and they sprinted toward the car, barely making it inside as the figures behind them reacted too slowly. The man with the tactical gear yelled, but it was too late. The door slammed shut, and the car roared to life. The car sped off, tires screeching as they tore down the road. Eli looked out the back window, seeing the figures slowly disappear in the distance. But he couldn't relax. Not yet. The driver, a tall man with a dark, scruffy beard, turned to them, his expression serious. "You're safe for now," he said, his voice firm but calming. "But you need to listen to me. You're not out of danger yet." Eli could feel the tension in the car. His mother was still breathing heavily, her hand clutching Eli's tightly. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice strained with confusion and fear. "My name's Sam," the man replied, "and I've been sent to get you out of there. I don't have time to explain everything, but those men are part of a much larger operation, and they've been tracking you for weeks. They know about your husband, and now they're after you." Eli's mind was spinning. Why? What does Dad have to do with all this? Sam's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, scanning the road behind them. "I don't have all the answers," he said, "but your father's in deep. He's been mixed up in something dangerous, something bigger than you realize. And now they're going to do whatever it takes to get what they want." Eli's heart raced. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His dad? Involved with dangerous people? The idea didn't make sense, but Sam's words carried weight, and Eli knew deep down that they weren't just running from random criminals. This was something far more serious. Eli looked at his mother, whose face was pale and drawn. She was struggling to keep her composure, but he could see the fear in her eyes. "What now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Sam glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes steely. "We keep moving. We don't stop until we're safe. And I'll tell you everything I know along the way. But for now, we have to keep running." Eli's mind was in turmoil. The night that had started as a typical evening was now a nightmare they couldn't escape from. And the only thing Eli knew for sure was that his father's secrets were pulling them deeper into danger with every passing minute. And he still had no idea what they were running from, or what would happen next. The car raced down the dark road, the headlights cutting through the night, illuminating trees and shadows that seemed to blur together as they sped past. The tires screeched around sharp turns, the engine growling as Sam pushed the car to its limits. Eli's hands gripped the seat, his stomach twisting in knots. He had never been so scared in his life. His world was a whirlwind of confusion and fear, and now they were being chased by people who wanted something from them, something that involved his father. But what? His mother, still pale and shaking, was staring out the window, her eyes distant. She had been quiet since they had gotten in the car, as if she was still processing everything that had happened. But Eli couldn't focus on that. His mind kept going back to the message he had received earlier. "They know where you are. Get out. Now." Who had sent it? Was it someone trying to help them? Or someone involved in whatever dangerous mess his father had gotten caught up in? "Sam," Mrs. Williams finally spoke, her voice trembling, but determined. "What's going on?" Why are we running? Why is my husband mixed up in all of this? You said he's involved with dangerous people, but how? What did he do? Sam glanced briefly at her in the rearview mirror. His jaw clenched, and for a moment, Eli thought he wasn't going to answer. But then he sighed, his eyes flicking back to the road. I wish I had all the answers, Sam said, his voice low. But I don't. Your husband got involved in something big. It's something he should have walked away from, but he didn't. And now, they're after him, and by extension, you and your kids. Eli's mind reeled. Who are they? Who's after us? Sam didn't answer right away. Instead, he made another sharp turn, and the car's tires screeched again. I don't know exactly, but they've been tracking your family for weeks. Your husband made a deal with the wrong people, and now they've got him. He's in over his head. Eli felt his stomach churn. His father? In over his head? It didn't seem possible. His dad was always so calm, so in control. Eli couldn't imagine him mixed up in something like this. Wait, Eli said, his voice shaking as he pieced things together. What do you mean, they've got him? Is Dad in trouble? Is he hurt? Sam's grip tightened on the steering wheel. I don't know, he admitted, but I know they're looking for him, and that means they're looking for you too. You have to trust me when I say this. Your father's actions have put you all in danger. These people don't stop until they get what they want. Eli's heart hammered in his chest. He didn't want to believe it. His dad wasn't the kind of man who would put his family at risk. He just couldn't be. But the way Sam talked, the way the FBI had raided their house, it was all real. His father's secrets were threatening everything Eli had ever known. As the car sped down the highway, Eli's mother finally spoke again. You said we need to keep moving. Where are we going? And what happens if they catch up to us? Sam's voice was low and serious. I have a safe house a few hours from here. We'll go there for now, but we need to be careful. If they're following us, we'll need to change routes frequently. They'll stop at nothing to find you. The weight of his words hit Eli like a ton of bricks. They were being hunted, and it was all because of his dad. A sense of dread settled over the car. Eli could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. His mother kept glancing over at him, her eyes filled with concern, but there was little she could do. She was just as lost and frightened as he was. The road ahead seemed endless, and every dark turn they made felt like a step deeper into uncertainty. It felt like they were being swallowed by the night. The further they went, the more Eli's mind raced with questions. What kind of people were after them? And what had his dad gotten into? Was it too late to fix things? Hours seemed to stretch on endlessly. Eli tried to stay awake, but his eyelids grew heavy. He couldn't relax, not with the looming uncertainty hanging over them. His mind was a blur, but one thought kept piercing through the fog. Where is Dad? Suddenly, Sam's voice cut through the silence. We're almost there. Stay alert. Eli sat up straighter, trying to focus. The dark trees outside the window had started to thin, and he could make out the silhouette of a small, isolated house in the distance. They were approaching their destination. The car pulled into the long gravel driveway, and Sam turned off the engine. For a moment, everything was quiet. Eli could hear the sound of crickets chirping outside and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Sam got out first, his movements swift and precise. Eli's mother followed, and then Eli hesitated before stepping out of the car. This is it, Sam said, looking around cautiously. We'll stay here until we can figure out our next move. Eli's mind was still racing. He had so many questions, but now there was no one to answer them. His mother, who had been so calm just a few hours ago, was visibly shaken. She hugged Eli close, her arms around him tight. She didn't say anything, but Eli could feel her fear. As Sam led them into the house, Eli noticed that it was small and modest, tucked away in the woods. It looked like the kind of place that no one would ever find unless they knew exactly where to look. The lights inside flickered on, casting shadows across the room. We'll stay here for the night, Sam said, his voice serious. Get some rest. I'll keep watch. Eli wanted to ask about the situation, about his dad, about the people who were after them, but he couldn't. It was all too much. So instead, he nodded, following his mother inside. The house smelled musty, like it had been abandoned for a long time, but it was safe. For now. After they settled in, Sam offered them some food, but neither Eli nor his mother was hungry. They both sat quietly, each lost in their own thoughts. The weight of everything, of the FBI, the strange man, the chase, hung over them. As the night wore on, Eli lay in the small bed in the corner of the room, staring at the ceiling. His mother was asleep in the bed next to him, her breathing slow and steady. But Eli couldn't sleep. His mind wouldn't let him. Where was his dad? What had he done? And more importantly, what were they going to do now? The silence of the house was broken only by the sound of the wind outside. Eli closed his eyes, trying to find some peace, but the thoughts kept coming. He didn't know if he would ever feel safe again. Then, just as he was beginning to drift off, the sound of a distant car engine rumbled through the night air. It was faint at first, but it grew louder and louder. Eli's heart raced again. They weren't alone. The car was getting closer. The danger hadn't passed. It was only just beginning. Eli's heart pounded in his chest, the sound of the approaching car growing louder with every passing second. He held his breath, straining to hear. The engine roared through the stillness of the night, sending a wave of panic coursing through him. They couldn't be followed already, could they? They had only just arrived at the safe house. Eli slowly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake his mother. She was deep in sleep, her face pale and worn from the events of the day. But Eli couldn't rest. His mind kept racing. Whoever was out there, they had to be looking for them. He just knew it. He crept to the window and peeked through the curtains, his eyes scanning the dark driveway. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the trees. Eli held his breath, trying to see who it was. It was too early to tell, but the car wasn't slowing down. It was headed straight for the house. Eli's stomach twisted in fear. His pulse quickened. He turned around, looking at his mother. She was still asleep, but the time for sleep was over. He couldn't wait for Sam's help. If they were in danger again, Eli had to act. He had to protect his family. Quietly, he padded to the door, opened it a crack, and peeked out into the hallway. Sam was nowhere to be seen. A chill ran down his spine. Where was he? Eli's eyes darted to the front door. The sound of the car's engine was getting closer, and soon it would be right outside. He needed to wake his mother, but the fear of disturbing her, of alerting whoever was coming, kept him frozen in place. The car finally stopped, its engine idling. Eli heard the sound of the door opening, then the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Whoever it was, they weren't wasting any time. Eli's breath caught in his throat. What do I do now? Suddenly, he heard a soft rustling behind him. Sam appeared in the doorway, his face serious but not panicked. He didn't speak at first, just watched Eli with a hard, calculating look. "They're here," Eli whispered, his voice shaky. Sam's gaze flicked to the window, then back to Eli. He didn't waste any time. "Get your mom," he said quietly, "and stay close." Eli nodded, his heart in his throat, and quickly moved back toward the bedroom. He reached for his mother's arm and gently shook her. "Mom, wake up," he whispered urgently. Mrs. Williams stirred, groggily opening her eyes. "What's happening?" she mumbled, still half asleep. "They're here," Eli said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We have to go. We have to leave now." The panic in Eli's voice roused his mother completely. She sat up in a hurry, looking around. "What? Who's here?" she asked, now fully awake. "Those people," Eli said, his eyes wide. "The ones after us." Mrs. Williams jumped out of bed, her expression tense. She grabbed Eli's hand, pulling him toward the door. Sam was already standing near the entrance, his face grim. "We don't have much time," Sam said. "I'll take care of it. You just get to the back exit." Eli didn't argue. He knew that they had to move fast. He and his mother quickly made their way through the small house toward the back. The footsteps outside were getting louder, more deliberate, as whoever it was got closer. The back door was already cracked open, and they slipped through it, into the cool night air. Eli could hear the wind rustling through the trees, and the crunch of gravel under their feet as they moved quickly away from the house. But the sound of the footsteps wasn't far behind. They weren't alone. Sam followed them out the back door, his eyes scanning the surrounding area as he led them toward a small, hidden shed behind the house. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "Stay here," Sam said, his voice low but firm. "I'll make sure they don't get inside." Eli and his mother huddled together in the shed, the wooden walls creaking around them as they tried to stay silent. Eli's heart was racing again. The air felt thick with tension, and every sound outside made him jump. "Do you think they'll find us?" Eli whispered, his voice barely audible. His mother didn't answer right away. She just pulled him closer, holding him tight. "I don't know," she said quietly, "but we can't let them take us. We can't let them get to your father." Eli shivered. He didn't know how much longer they could keep running. His dad was somewhere out there, and the people who were chasing them, whoever they were, weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. And Eli was starting to realize that it wasn't just about his dad anymore. They were after his whole family. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Every sound outside made Eli's stomach twist. He wanted to know what was happening, but Sam had told them to stay put, and Eli trusted him. He had to. Suddenly, a loud noise from the front of the house shattered the quiet. It was a crash, followed by the sound of shouting. Eli's heart jumped. The people were inside the house. "Sam," Mrs. Williams whispered urgently. "What's going on?" Eli could hear the frantic footsteps, the sound of something heavy being moved, and then the sound of a voice, one that was harsh and commanding. It was a man, and he wasn't alone. "Where are they?" The man's voice shouted, his anger unmistakable. "They can't be far. Find them." Eli's breath caught in his throat. They were close, too close. The men were inside the house now, and they were looking for them. Through the crack in the shed, Eli saw a flash of movement. It was Sam, moving quickly, his hands steady as he peered out at the men from behind a tree. He was scanning the area, clearly trying to figure out where to go next. Eli wanted to run, to leave, but Sam's stern gaze caught his. "Stay quiet," he mouthed. The men outside were growing more impatient. "Check the back." They couldn't have gone far, one of them ordered. Sam glanced at the ground, then back at the shed. Eli could see him getting ready to move again, and for a split second, Eli thought he might have a plan. But that was when it happened. A shadow appeared in the doorway of the shed. Eli's blood ran cold. The man had found them. Before Eli could even react, the door was thrown open, and the figure stepped inside. Everything inside Eli screamed to run, but he couldn't move. The man looked at him, then at his mother, his eyes cold and filled with intent. It was too late to hide. "What's this?" the man sneered, taking a step closer. "The hunt is over, kid." And that was when Eli knew they were no longer running. The chase had ended. Eli's breath caught in his throat as the man stepped further into the shed, his cold eyes scanning the room. The harsh glow from the moonlight silhouetted his figure, making him look taller, more menacing. Eli could see his mother's hand tighten around his, her fingers cold with fear. The man's boots scraped across the wooden floor as he advanced. "Mom," Eli whispered, barely able to speak. His mother didn't say anything, but her grip on his hand tightened, her knuckles white. She was frozen, but not in fear. Eli could feel it. She was calculating, trying to figure out what to do. They couldn't let him take them. They couldn't. The man stopped just a few feet away from them. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his eyes glinted with malicious intent. "So, we've got ourselves a little family reunion," the man said, his voice low and mocking. Eli's stomach twisted with fear. Who was this man? What did he want with them? The thought that these people were after his father, and now after them, was too much to comprehend. But there was no time to think. They had to act, and fast. Without warning, the man reached for something at his side, a gun. Eli's heart slammed against his chest, and instinctively, he pulled his mother closer, as if somehow his presence could shield her from whatever was coming next. His eyes darted around the small shed, searching for anything they could use. The man, noticing Eli's movement, smirked. "You can try to run," he said, the gun now pointed in their direction. "But it won't do you any good. Your father's already in the hands of the people I work for. There's nowhere left to hide." Eli felt his pulse thumping in his ears. He knew they couldn't outrun this man. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a part of something bigger, something far more dangerous than Eli could even begin to understand. And if they didn't get away now, if they didn't escape. Suddenly, a sound broke through the night. It was a car door slamming. Eli's eyes widened. "Sam," he whispered. "Sam's back." His mother, sensing the same thing, held her breath, watching the man closely. The man looked over his shoulder, his grip on the gun tightening. For a moment, Eli thought he'd spotted something, an opportunity. And that's when it happened. There was a loud crash from the front of the shed, with splintering, followed by the sound of a body hitting the ground. The man in front of them whipped around just as the door to the shed was thrown open, and Sam appeared, his arms moving in a blur as he tackled the man to the ground. The gun went flying across the floor, sliding into the corner of the shed, out of reach. "Get down!" Sam shouted at Eli and his mother, his voice urgent. He was on top of the man now, wrestling him to the ground, his fists landing hard on the man's face. Eli's mother didn't need to be told twice. She pulled Eli to the floor, keeping low, her hands over his ears as the fight unfolded in front of them. Eli could hear the sounds of struggling, the grunts and curses as Sam and the man fought. Eli's mind raced. Was Sam going to be okay? Was this man alone? How many more were out there? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sam managed to pin the man down, his knee pressed firmly against his chest. The man squirmed beneath him, but Sam was relentless. "You should have stayed away," Sam growled, holding the man down with one arm while his other hand searched the man's pockets. Eli watched in stunned silence, his heart still racing. His mother kept him close, shielding him as best as she could, but her eyes were fixed on Sam and the man. She didn't speak. She was waiting, just like Eli. Sam finally stood up, pulling the man roughly to his feet. "You're going to talk?" Sam said, his voice cold and commanding. "Tell me where they're holding him." The man spat, his face bruised from the struggle. "I'm not telling you anything," he sneered, trying to break free. Sam tightened his grip on the man's arm, pulling him closer. "You don't have a choice. You can either tell me, or I can make it worse." The man glared at him, but Sam didn't flinch. There was a long, tense silence before the man finally spoke, his voice low. "They've got him," he said, through gritted teeth. "They're keeping him at the warehouse on the edge of town. But it won't matter. It's too late. The people you're running from, they don't lose." Eli's stomach churned at the thought of his father being held captive, but Sam didn't hesitate. He turned to Eli's mother. "We need to go now," he said. "We don't have much time." Eli's mother nodded, her face pale but determined. "Let's go," she said, standing up and pulling Eli to his feet. Sam motioned for them to follow him, his eyes scanning the yard as he led them out of the shed. They quickly made their way to the back of the house, where another car was parked, a nondescript, unmarked vehicle. "We're going to get your father back," Sam said as they got into the car. "I'm not letting them win." Eli's heart felt like it might burst. His father was at the warehouse. They were so close to finding him, but it wasn't going to be easy. The people who had his father were dangerous, and they wouldn't just let him go without a fight. As the car pulled away from the safe house, the headlights cutting through the dark, Eli couldn't shake the fear that clung to him. They were heading into unknown danger. His father's life was in the balance, and so was their own. And as they sped through the night, Eli realized that this was just the beginning. The chase had started, and it wasn't over yet. The car's engine hummed steadily as it cut through the night, but Eli couldn't shake the fear that had settled deep in his chest. The world outside the window blurred past, but everything inside the car felt frozen. His thoughts kept circling around the same question. What now? They were going to the warehouse. They were going to rescue his father. But what if it was too late? What if they couldn't get to him in time? Eli glanced at his mother, who sat beside him, her face grim. She hadn't spoken since they left the safe house. She was gripping her seat, her knuckles white, her eyes flicking nervously between Sam and the road ahead. Sam, who was driving, kept his focus straight ahead. His jaw was tight, his hands steady on the wheel. He had said they didn't have much time, but he didn't seem to be rushing. It was almost as if he was waiting for something, waiting for the next move. Eli couldn't figure it out, but Sam's demeanor gave him a strange sense of calm, even though they were heading straight into danger. "How far is the warehouse?" Mrs. Williams asked, her voice breaking the silence. "We're about 15 minutes out," Sam answered, his voice steady but urgent. "But we need to be careful. The people holding your husband won't hesitate to hurt anyone who gets in their way." Eli's stomach twisted at the thought. He wanted to believe they could do it, that they could break in, rescue his dad, and escape unharmed. But part of him knew it wasn't going to be that simple. This wasn't some simple rescue mission. They were up against people who had no moral code, people who would do whatever it took to protect their secrets. As the car turned onto a narrow road, the headlights revealed the silhouette of an old building in the distance. The warehouse. It looked abandoned, but Eli knew that appearances could be deceiving. This place was dangerous, and there was no telling what waited inside. Sam slowed the car as they approached the building, pulling into a small, unmarked parking lot on the side. They parked far enough from the entrance to avoid drawing attention, but close enough to make a quick getaway if they needed it. "Stay low," Sam instructed, his eyes flicking between the building and the car. "We don't know how many of them are inside, but it's best to assume they're expecting us." Eli nodded, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure if he was more scared of what might happen inside the warehouse or what could happen if they didn't get his dad out of there. They had to move quickly. The three of them slipped out of the car, keeping close to the shadows as they made their way toward the building. The night air felt colder now, the sound of their footsteps muffled against the ground. Eli could hear the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears, drowning out all other noises. As they reached the back of the warehouse, Sam motioned for them to stop. He pulled out a small flashlight, shining it on the door handle. It was locked, but Sam had anticipated this. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a set of lock-picking tools. Eli watched, his breath shallow, as Sam worked quickly. His movements were practiced and smooth, but there was an urgency to them that made Eli's chest tighten. He had never seen Sam in action like this, calm, focused, almost too calm for what they were about to do. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open just enough for them to slip inside. Sam led the way, moving cautiously but with purpose. Eli followed closely behind, his mother right beside him. Inside, the warehouse was dark, but Eli could make out the outlines of crates and machinery scattered around the space. The smell of metal and dust filled the air, and the silence was deafening. There was no sign of anyone immediately, but Eli knew that wasn't a good thing. If the warehouse was empty, it meant they were being watched, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Stay behind me," Sam whispered, motioning for them to follow closely. They moved further into the warehouse, the dim light from Sam's flashlight casting long shadows across the room. Every step they took seemed to echo louder than the last. Eli could feel the tension mounting, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His father was somewhere in here, somewhere in this maze of crates and shadows, and they had to find him before it was too late. They rounded a corner, and Eli's heart nearly stopped. There, in the center of the room, stood a figure. A tall man with his back to them, speaking quietly into a phone. His words were muffled, but Eli could make out a few sentences. He was speaking to someone important. "The package is here," the man said. "We can't afford any mistakes. Do whatever it takes to stop them." Eli's blood ran cold. The package? Was that code for his father? The man hung up the phone, turning slightly. Eli's eyes widened as he recognized him. It was the same man who had been in their house, the one Eli had pointed to, the one who had been taken by the FBI. But he was here now, standing in front of them. He wasn't in handcuffs anymore. He was free, and he was working with the people who had his father. Sam didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, his movements quick and precise. The man barely had time to react before Sam knocked the phone out of his hand and tackled him to the ground. "Get back!" Sam shouted at Eli and his mother. Eli froze for a split second, but his mother grabbed his arm, pulling him away just as the sound of a gunshot rang through the warehouse. The bullet missed them by inches, ricocheting off a nearby crate. "Go!" Sam shouted again, struggling with the man on the ground. Eli and his mother didn't need any more urging. They ran, weaving through the dark aisles of the warehouse, their footsteps echoing in the chaos. The sound of more footsteps shouting, and the metallic click of guns filled the air. Eli's heart raced as they sprinted through the warehouse, but ahead of them, he could see another figure, a shadow moving in the dim light. It was a man, and he was holding something, a figure that looked like his father. "Dad," Eli cried, the words slipping from his lips before he could stop it. The figure turned, his face illuminated by the flashlight. It wasn't his father, but it was someone else, someone who looked just as dangerous. Before Eli could react, the man raised his gun, aiming directly at them. And then, all at once, everything exploded. Gunfire, shouting, chaos. It was all happening too fast, too suddenly. Eli's mother yanked him to the ground just as the sound of bullets filled the air. But Eli's mind couldn't focus on anything but the figure in the distance. His father was still out there, and the clock was running out. Eli's heart hammered in his chest, every beat echoing like a drum in his ears. His mother's grip on him was iron-tight as they crouched behind a stack of crates, the sound of gunfire ringing through the warehouse, deafening in its intensity. He could hear voices shouting, the crackle of footsteps as men scrambled for position. His mind was racing, overwhelmed by the chaos. His father was somewhere in here, but where? The man with the gun they had seen earlier was still advancing toward them, but Sam had created a momentary distraction, engaging with another figure in the distance. The warehouse was a maze of shadows and sound, but in the midst of it all, Eli's only focus was his father. "Stay low," his mother whispered urgently, pulling Eli deeper behind the crates. "We need to find him." Eli nodded, but every second felt like an eternity. His thoughts were a jumbled mess. He needed to help Sam, but more than that, he needed to find his father. Where is he? Suddenly, through the haze of smoke and gunfire, Eli saw a figure. The tall silhouette of a man, his hands bound with thick rope, was being dragged across the floor by two others. Eli's breath caught in his throat. "Dad." It was his father. Without thinking, Eli bolted forward, his legs pumping as fast as they could carry him. His mother shouted his name, but he was already running. He couldn't stop now, not when his dad was so close. The gunfire rang out again, and Eli felt a sharp pain of fear cut through him. But he didn't stop. He kept running, his eyes locked on his father, who seemed to be barely conscious, stumbling under the weight of his captors. Eli pushed harder, darting around crates, his heart racing faster than his feet could move. He could hear footsteps behind him, chasing him, but he wasn't going to stop. Not now. "Dad!" Eli screamed as he neared the men who had his father. His voice cracked with desperation. The men turned, surprised by Eli's sudden appearance. One of them raised his gun, but before he could fire, Sam was there. He moved faster than Eli had ever seen anyone move, knocking the gun from the man's hand and sending him crashing to the ground. "Eli, get back!" Sam shouted, his face a mask of determination. But it was too late. Eli was already at his father's side, crouching down in front of him. His father's eyes flickered open, just for a moment, and Eli could see the relief in them. "Eli." His father's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "What are you doing here?" You shouldn't." "We're getting out of here, Dad," Eli said, his voice tight with emotion. "We're going home." Eli's father looked at him, a strange mixture of pride and sadness in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, son," he murmured. I never wanted you to get caught up in this." Eli shook his head. "We don't have time for this, Dad. We need to go now." With a strength he didn't know he had, Eli helped his father to his feet, keeping him steady as they began to move. But before they could take another step, one of the remaining men lunged at them, a knife in his hand. "Move!" Sam shouted, his voice urgent. Sam tackled the man to the ground, and in a blur of action, the man was quickly neutralized. It was over in an instant, but the noise of the struggle had attracted the attention of more men, and now they were coming fast. "We're not safe yet," Sam said, his voice firm. "Move quickly now." Eli's father leaned heavily on him as they made their way to the back of the warehouse, where the exit was hidden behind a stack of heavy crates. Sam cleared the way, checking every corner with precise movements. They were almost there. But as they reached the exit, The sound of approaching vehicles rumbled in the distance. The chase wasn't over. "Get in," Sam ordered as he shoved open the back door, revealing an old, rusted van. Without thinking, Eli helped his father inside, followed by his mother. They were crammed into the back of the van, the air thick with tension as Sam quickly slammed the door shut and climbed into the driver's seat. "Hold on," Sam muttered as he started the engine, the van lurching forward. Eli looked out the back window, his heart in his throat. The men from the warehouse were closing in, their headlights shining brightly in the dark, but they wouldn't catch them. Not tonight. The van sped through the streets, weaving between traffic, as Sam expertly navigated their escape. The tension inside the van was palpable, but Eli could feel a shift. His father, still weak, was sitting upright beside him. His mother was watching over him, her face full of relief, but also sorrow. They were free for now. They had made it. The city passed by in a blur, the familiar streets fading behind them as they drove into the unknown. Eli didn't know where they were going or what would come next, but he knew one thing for certain: they had survived. His family was together again, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Eli let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, they were finally free. But the road ahead would be long. There would be more obstacles, more danger. The people who had come after them wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But Eli didn't care. As long as his family was together, he would fight for them, no matter what. They had made it this far. They could keep going. And no matter what came next, Eli knew one thing for sure: they wouldn't stop running.